Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank IDSA and specifically Colonel Gautam for inviting me for this conference. It's indeed a delight to be here. Well, the title of the paper, which I'm going to present today, is Revisiting Arthasastra Back to Understanding IR. I think before I start, it would be appropriate to ask the question, why Arthasastra? Is there really a need to go back to Arthasastra? After all, it dates back to the end of 4th century BC, when the idea of state had not even entered the lexicon of political science. Moreover, why should we explore Arthasastra now, when it had been under oblivion for centuries, and it was only in the early 20th century that a priest called Shamasastri tried to locate it and brought it to the public domain. Also, by 20th century, the conceptual idea of the state was well entrenched. It was closely associated with the Treaty of Westphalia, and 1648, so to say, had become the classic departure point for understanding the state and its larger role in the broader disciplinary understanding of international relations. Well, having said this, and also sort of trying to identify the broad limitations which are embedded in interpreting Arthasastra, I would argue that Arthasastra is important and significant because it appropriately captures the idea of the state both at the domestic and at the international level. It is significant because it challenges the centricity of international relations to its Western origins. It challenges the disciplinary discourse which dominantly traces the strand of realism back to Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, and also challenges the basic discourse in IR, which, so to say, for a brief period of time got locked between realism, schools of realism, and idealism, which had no real place for non-Western conceptualizations. Thus, it is within this broad framework that I would try to situate this paper. This paper primarily aims to fill the gap between the Western philosophical thought and the Eastern philosophical thought through the Kautilyan perspective. It underlines the fact that state was the primary reference point of analysis and that the state was also a distinct autonomous actor. The main argument of my paper is that political virtue or political morality is one of the analytical strands in Kautilya's Arthasastra, and that the idea of power and order are primarily influenced by the concept of political virtue or political morality, and political morality here being widely understood under the rubric of end-means debate, underlining the idea that immoral means can be used to achieve moral or worthy ends. The end here, again in the Kautilyan context, is defined largely as a service to national interest, and the idea of national interest itself stems from the happiness of the people. Well, having said this, let me briefly go to the basic format of this paper. The paper is divided into 3 sections. Section 1 focuses on the significance for undertaking comparative studies and the need for establishing a conversation between the Western philosophical tradition and the Eastern philosophical tradition. Section 2 focuses on the concept of state and discusses briefly how the variables of political virtue, order, and power are interpreted, interrelated, interconnected, and complement each other. And finally, Section 3 offers some key insights on how the study of Arthasastra could facilitate a Kautilyan understanding in international relations. Now, before I really go on to the role of state, which is really the essential argument of this paper, I think there are certain factors which need to be reckoned with. The first is to underline the need for a dialogue, and when one talks about a dialogue between the Eastern tradition and the Western tradition, I think a question which automatically comes into mind is that, is the Western philosophical tradition universal? And the answer is, of course, no, because there are other competing perspectives which are vying for attention. So the question here of concern is of engaging with the dominant discourses of international relations, and I guess Arthasastra offers one such opportunity. Also, when one talks about establishing a dialogue between the East and the West, there are certain questions which again needs to be flagged off. The first is, can ideas of rights, justice, power, equality be universal? The second is, concepts as they are generally understood in social science generally have their roots in societal structures and are informed by their communitarian origins. Therefore, how do societal norms shape basic ideas of rights, justice, equality, and can they be a universal explanation for these? The third question is that, is the Western understanding similar to that of the Eastern understanding, or do various cultures inform priority of certain principles or political choices? And the fourth question actually stems from the third one, which says, how much is culture responsible in shaping some of the core questions related to politics? How is the political defined in various societies, and can the international be subsumed within the ambit of distinct cultural political understanding? This paper therefore attempts to address some of these questions by undertaking a textual analysis of Arthasastra. It attempts to interpret concepts of political virtue, power, and order differently, and analyzes how the Kautilyan interpretation interacts with that of the Western notion associated with these concepts. Now, if one clearly looks at the Kautilyan lens, and this is my second section, one can actually interpret it from various vantage points. The first interpretation is that it is a welfare state where the interest of the king and the people were one. The citations are there in my paper. There are certain interpretations, scholars have worked on it. And the other interpretation is that of a totalitarian state, as the main argument stems from this, this particular piece of thought, says that people did not really have any right against the state. And I would actually say that there is a need for caution here, because in the Hindu political tradition, the concept of duties always came before rights. And therefore, before one takes an analogy and says that the Arthashastra was a totalitarian state, I think it's a bit of an analytical overstretch, because of the times that that Arthashastra was A, situated in, and B, also because the idea of duties was really emphasized upon, something which I will come back to later. But the second point, again, which really comes to mind after taking a good reading of Arthashastra, is that state is really the central referent point, both at the domestic level and at the international level. At the domestic level, the 7 pillars of the state, or the constituent elements of the state, for instance, symbolize its strong state capacity, or the strength of the state to enforce decisions, so to say, in an authoritarian manner. And the second is at the international level, where the concept of mandala theory underlines the aspect of sovereignty on one hand and autonomy on the other. Again, something which I'll come back to later. But having said this, let me now just flag off certain basic facts, which I think is very important when one attempts to understand the Kautilyan state. The first fact is, before an expedition is undertaken, the strength of the state should be gauged. And this is Kautilya's advice. I think this signifies that domestic interests should be prioritized before an expansionist agenda, for an expansionist design or an adventure, and domestic interests categorically mean the welfare of the people, which constitutes national interest. Fact 2. The second fact, again, which comes to the fore when one reads Arthashastra, is that natural calamities were linked to conflicts and wars, which again means that non-traditional security issues were considered issues carrying definite potential strategic weight. And again, the idea that non-traditional security threats were very well conceptualized, preempted by Arthashastra, and it was, so to say, because it came under the ambit of state security, constituted a part of the traditional security threat. The third factor, again, the third fact which again comes to the fore when one reads Arthashastra, is that intellectual power was considered an important variant of power and a moral resource. Again, a significant point, because power was not a unidimensional concept. It was associated broadly, and not broadly associated with violence and force. I will come to the versions or the variants of power a bit later. And fact 4, again, the fact which comes to the mind when one reads Arthashastra, is that justice, political virtue, dharma, political morality, whatever I would have used these words interchangeably, shaped the understanding of expansion and wealth. Now, this is again a very significant point, as wealth in itself was not really an end. Three objectives which were identified with the state in Arthasastra are wealth, justice, and expansion. It is interesting to note that not only justice forms the central reference point, but also according to Kautilyan thought, material well-being is only a part of the larger idea of the state. Kautilya also believed that a stable and prosperous state could only be secured through just administration, and that stability and justice were preconditions for accumulation of wealth, which was then used to augment territory. Now again, two elements which again are very important to understand the Kautilyan state and the idea of order are the concept of dharma and danda. And it was the interaction of these two elements, dharma and danda, that actually perpetuated order in the Kautilyan state. Now dharma, so to say, was the functional element of the state. To go into the etymological derivations of dharma, it is derived from the word dhar, which means hold, or dhairya. I mean, that is dhairya, which means to hold, and is broadly understood as a concept which holds society together. Dharma had a special place in Hindu political thought, as the society was held together by each individual and groups doing his or her specific duty. While society became an ordered whole when held by dharma, what really shaped the societal order was the karma of the individual. And karma here meant action or the duty of the individual, which in turn shaped the dharma. Thus, the idea of dharma and karma in Kautilyan Arthashastra are deeply related. An individual karma not only determines his caste or his place in the societal matrix, but also the dharma or his duty as an individual, not only to the family, but also to the society at large. Danda now, coming to the next concept, on the contrary, regulated this dharma. The danda, basically the use of rod or punishment, regulated this dharma and therefore was subsumed within the broader logic of dharma. So it's interesting to see how dharma and danda actually interact. Danda was a part of the dharma, and dharma, because of the order, because of karma, because of certain duties which an individual had, actually ordered the society. And this, I'm talking about the domestic level. So in this context, the dharma of the king directed the broad contours of political morality or virtue, and emphasized the qualities broadly identified with that of a just king. The idea of morality thus is present in Arthashastra in varying degrees. Political morality advances the idea of balancing the concept of dharma with pragmatism. One can also say that political morality is about thinking strategies or crafting policies which minimize harm to your own citizens. And Kautilya is very categorical in stating that the interest of the state or the population or the subjects in general should be prioritized. Now similarly now this is the domestic, the order at the domestic and the international level. Domestic, the idea of dharma, karma, and danda kind of really interact. Karma and danda are subsumed with the larger logic of dharma. And at the international level, order was shaped through the concept of mandala theory, where the two concepts of hegemonial authority and autonomy shaped the system. The conqueror being the dominant force, and this what is really what was really meant by hegemonial authority, and autonomy because it was strictly laid out. It laid out or emphasized the principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states. So just to conclude this section, I would just flag off certain basic points. The first is that state was thus an active participant. It was rent-seeking and revenue extracting, yes, but then as it was, so to say, a welfare state, it is portrayed more as a benign construct because all the revenues just went back to building the basic infrastructure of the society, and the state really took an active responsibility of the people. And some of the examples which Kautilya underlines and which broadly can sort of be related to the idea of political virtue are the idea of yoke shame, which means that the welfare of the people, because Kautilya placed great importance on the welfare of the people, and his practical advice to the king on facilitating the happiness of the people was rooted in the king's dharma. Kautilya also pointed out that internal rebellion is more dangerous than the external one, and therefore the interest of the people should always be the priority of the king. So you do see an element of pragmatism here. Artha, wealth is the means and not the ends. So Kautilya speaks. This is what Arthasastra tells us. A good example of this is Kautilya's discussion on promotion of economic activity. Kautilya writes that the king should augment his power by promoting the welfare of the people, for power comes from the countryside, which is the source of all economic activity. So everything was linked broadly how to maintain order. National calamities, disasters, epidemics are really the third point, which also add to the broader idea of political morality or dharma, because Kautilya's response to unforeseen calamities is also a pointer to how issues of human and socio-economic welfare were prioritized by the state. Kautilya writes, in times of calamities, the land should not only be capable of sustaining population, but also should sustain outsiders when they come into the kingdom in times of calamities. So Kautilya did foresee the linkage between natural disasters and potential conflict, and epidemics and environmental security came really under the wider ambit of state security, again because state really took the active responsibility for the lives of the people, and this really makes me to kind of describe or adhere to the fact that the Kautilyan state was in fact a welfare state. And the fourth point on duties is also important, because if you see the starting point of Western philosophical tradition, be it Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau, is the rights of the individual. So the rights is really the starting point for the Western political philosophers. But then here, it's the idea of duties, which really Kautilya is emphasizing on. And the idea of duty is kind of related to the karma. Karma is related to the duty because this is what a person should do because he's born in that particular caste. So the idea of duties comes first rather than the idea of responsibilities. That's the main point. And Purushartha is the effort of the individual, because there are instances when Kautilya talks about certain treaties where one has to, and he talks about not a written text, but he talks about verbal agreements, because he says that it's not only in this lifetime, but the karma of the individual will be taken on to the other lifetime. So I think the idea of morality is very much there, and it has a very distinct flavor when you read the Kautilyan text. Now, before I kind of really conclude, all right, so let me just, because I've spoken a bit on order, what I'll really do is that skip this a bit, but then I think 2 points which really need attention here is the idea of hegemonial authority and autonomy, which Adam Watson talks about, and he's one scholar who's done good study on Arthasastra. Now, Watson defines hegemonial authority as a group of states where the societal elements are shaped by a dominant or a common culture. Autonomy broadly has been understood as non-interference, as Watson states that it was required of the conqueror to respect local forms and traditions. And Kautilya here is kind of emphasizing on the point that acceptance of, again, there is a sense of pragmatism here, because he's saying acceptance of autonomy could bring benefits to both the ruler and the ruled, as enforcement of direct administration could require more effort, money, and even more blood than it was worth. Now, coming quickly to the concept of power. The idea of power is not just coercive power. Violence is just one tool in Kautilya's grand strategy. Preceding violence or force is samadhana bheda. Kautilya writes that strength is power and happiness is the objective of using power. Power, interestingly, has been associated with various variants of legitimacy, soft and hard power, and authority. And when one talks about legitimacy, a good parallel can be made to Max Weber's understanding of power as domination, where domination is really the exercise of power through command with the probability that such command will be obeyed. Weber also believed that when legitimacy is ascribed by participants, power can be endured and sustained over a period of time. Weber also termed authority as legitimate power, and took this analysis further to describe the state as an actor who had the monopoly over the legitimate use of force. Now, the idea of legitimacy on the use of force can be equated with danda, right? Being subsumed within the broader concept of dharma. Danda, in other words, was necessary to provide order to society. According to Arthasastra, and I quote here, every society needs a sovereign power-wielding kshatriya, that is, the power of command, to maintain order and protect creatures. Hence, dandaniti, the science of punishment, has been the core of instruction of kings in ancient times. Now, coming to soft and hard power, Kautilya does not exclude the possibility of coercion, but also does not limit himself to just coercive power. He talks about, defines power as counsel and correct judgment, might and enthusiasm and energy, and he says the success resulting from each one is intellectual, physical, and psychological. And finally, the idea of authority is also very much present there. And in fact, Hannah Arendt kind of makes a very interesting parallel and distinguish authority from power and violence. The Kautilyan state had a sense of authority because it deeply penetrated into the society. And according to Hannah Arendt, the authority or power is incompatible with persuasion, which presupposes equality and works through a process of argumentation. And she says that even power cannot really be defined as authority, because the moment you use power or coercion, you actually kill authority. So if authority is to be defined, so writes Hannah Arendt, it has to be in contradistinction with force and authority. The Kautilyan state was very much authoritarian through the deep penetration of state in the society, especially in the economic realm. The reason it differed from the totalitarian form of government is that the king did not rule as per his whims and fancies, but was accountable to the population at large. In fact, some political thinkers have distinguished between authority and power. Authority, in many ways, implied adhikar, which meant deserved right. So the idea of legitimacy is very much associated with that of authority. And here authority and legitimacy are kind of, so to say, broader variants of power, not just equated just to force in a very direct manner. So finally, I think I won't really take much time, but just present the few concluding thoughts which kind of stem from my analysis. The first is that one can indeed find parallels between Western concepts and Kautilyan concepts. It's just a matter of awareness, I think, what the NSA was talking about in the morning. Idea of political virtue emerges as a central pillar, thus shaping the broader understanding of order and power. Arthasastra underlines the significance of a strong state, and that is, I think, a very important takeaway point. Domestic needs need to be prioritized before external priorities or interests, and the constituent unit of the state is really the starting point rather than the anarchical system, as it is the strength of the state that determines the international system or the geopolitical order, and this is what the mandala theory what broadly tells us. So thank you for listening to me. I would conclude it.